Climate, as you know, is a lot of worry in the United States these days. There's a lot of activism about it. But there's some dark realities behind all of that that a lot of people don't realize. When you dig into the data, what you discover is that our influence as part of living is actually making a difference in the climate, not just from the CO2, but because, well, take for example, Chicago O'Hare Airport, the identifier is ORD. And that does not stand for O'Hare, it stands for the original airport, Orchard Field. And so it used to be an orchard, and now it's a megaplex of concrete and asphalt, but they still measure the temperature there. That concrete and asphalt retains heat overnight, and that brings the overnight low temperature up. And as a result, that affects the average temperature. And so when you look for the climate signal, you're looking for the average temperature. So the question is, how much of what we're seeing today in the United States is from infrastructure affecting the low versus real climate change? I surveyed almost 1,000 weather stations in California and the United States, covered the whole United States, both through myself and through the work of people that were supporting me. And this booklet here kind of describes some of the root problems associated with measuring temperature. I want to show you a couple of pictures. This is a station in Idaho, and this is the sensor that NOAA uses to determine the high and low temperature for the day over long term. But it is actually, this one's in Idaho and this one's in Oklahoma. This is a west-facing wall, and during the day, this wall of this fire station where they measure the temperature heats up, and at night it releases all of that heat. That affects the low temperature. And this is what I've been talking about related to how man and the structural environment we live in affects the temperature. Every city in the United States has something called the urban heat island effect. And as a result, it's warmer in the cities than it is in the suburbs. And you can test this yourself with your own automobile thermometer as you drive along the freeways and go towards the outskirts of town. And that effect, that urban heat island effect, does figure into the climate change signal. The major thing about climate is that in California in particular, the Pacific Ocean affects the climate of California more than anything. We've had some of the worst fires ever in the last few years. And some people point to that as saying, oh, well, that's a factor from climate change. But when you look at the data, and again, the data really speaks to all of this, we've had far worse fires in the past in terms of the number of acres that have been burned in California. But what's happened over the past 50 years is fire suppression and clearing suppression has made for a larger fuel load. Plus that, California's population has expanded. And if you look at what the real ignition sources are, when you look at that data, you find that almost all the fires in the last 20 so years have been started by man or some influence of man, such as power lines or arson or whatever. And so with more people, more fuel load, fires are bound to get worse, and climate change really isn't a factor. Weather events that we experience, like thunderstorms and that sort of thing, flash floods, are not necessarily climate driven. We've had those for millennia, and they'll continue to be that way. What we are seeing is some changes in the overall weather patterns, and so in some cases we're getting weather patterns in the west that are a little drier or a little wetter depending on how the climate goes. There are some long-term effects, and yes, man is affecting the climate, but is it a catastrophe? Is it an emergency? I don't think so. We've historically thrived in warmer periods. The Roman warm period, the medieval warm periods were both periods in history of mankind where we advanced gradually and very forcefully forward. Darker times were when it was cold and wet. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein during a cold, wet period, for example. So we'll survive. We will adapt. I would just not panic. A lot of young people today that I talk to are scared. They're fearful for the future. They think climate is going to, well, affect their life in the future. I'm hoping to bring some balance to that, to show them that, yes, the climate is changing, but no, don't freak out about it. The world's going to hell in a handbasket, and we have to save it. And anything that's not, that severe, well, you're just a denier. I'm not in the hook, line, and sinker view of we have a catastrophe looming. New York, for example. New York, the earliest city in the United States, one of them anyway, and the sea level in New York City, well, there's this threat of sea level rise that's going to inundate cities, but the fact is, if you look at New York's history, you look at its not its skyline, but its harbor line over history, they've dealt with sea level rise for the past 300 years. It's been a gradual thing. And so, again, humans adapt. We're pretty darn smart. We're the most successful top-end species on the planet. I think we'll live.